Buying Chinese weapons is easy. In fact, it might be the easiest defense procurement decision a government can make today. The catalog is broad, the prices are competitive, delivery is fast, political conditions are minimal, sometimes refreshingly so. For many militaries facing budget pressure, urgent capability gaps, or Western export restrictions, Chinese weapons look like a rational solution. And on paper, they often are. But here is the part that rarely makes headlines and almost never appears in procurement brochures. The real difficulty does not begin at the signing ceremony. It begins the first day the system is supposed to operate inside a real military. According to SIPRI's 2023 arms transfer data, China is now one of the world's largest weapons exporters. From a U.S. defense planning perspective, that matters less because of the market share and more because of where those systems end up. They end up inside mixed fleets, alongside Western platforms, legacy Soviet equipment, locally modified systems, coalition-trained units, and suddenly, a weapon that functioned perfectly in isolation starts behaving very differently inside an ecosystem it was never designed for. This is not about whether Chinese weapons are bad. That framing is lazy and strategically unhelpful. The more interesting question is this: why do so many militaries discover that using Chinese weapons is far more complicated than buying them? And why does that quietly matter to Washington, NATO, and US allies far beyond those countries? Because in modern warfare, combat power is no longer defined by the platform you purchase. It is defined by what that platform can integrate with, how it can be sustained, and whether it still works when the shooting starts without a phone call to the manufacturer. From a US and allied military perspective, this is not a procurement story. It is a systems story. And systems, not slogans, decide how wars are actually fought. To understand why this problem keeps repeating, we need to be clear about why Chinese weapons spread so quickly in the first place. This was not an accident, and it was not driven by ignorance on the buyer's side. Over the past 2 decades, China deliberately positioned itself as the most accessible arms supplier in the global market. Not the most advanced, not the most interoperable, but the most available. Chinese defense firms offer 3 things many governments quietly prioritize. First, speed. Contracts move faster, delivery timelines are shorter, bureaucratic friction is minimal. Second, price. Upfront costs are often significantly lower than Western alternatives, an important factor for militaries operating under political and fiscal constraints. And third, political flexibility. Beijing generally avoids attaching governance conditions, alliance commitments, or operational expectations to arms sales. For many buyers, especially in Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, this is not reckless behavior. It is rational decision-making under pressure. According to SIPRI data from 2023, most recipients of Chinese weapons are not adversaries of the United States. They are hedging states, partners, sometimes quiet security collaborators. From Washington's perspective, this is where the story becomes strategically relevant. Because procurement decisions are not isolated events, they are long-term structural choices. A tank, an aircraft, or an air defense system does not simply add firepower. It shapes training pipelines, maintenance ecosystems, data sharing compatibility, and crisis time coordination. In other words, it shapes whether that military can operate with others. And this is the central tension. Chinese weapons are often purchased to increase autonomy, to reduce dependence on Western suppliers. Yet, in practice, many of these systems introduce a different kind of dependence. Not political dependence, but technical, logistical, and operational dependence that only becomes visible years later. For US and allied defense planners, this complicates a core assumption: that future conflicts will be fought by coalitions operating across shared systems, shared data, and shared operational logic. The question is no longer why countries buy Chinese weapons. The more important question is what those weapons quietly do to the military ecosystems they enter and how that reshapes coalition warfare before any crisis even begins. The problem with Chinese weapons does not usually reveal itself in test ranges, military expos, or promotional videos. It reveals itself later, when those systems are asked to operate inside real force structures, under real operational pressure. Let's break down why. First, integration is where the hidden cost begins. Most modern militaries do not operate clean, single-origin inventories. They operate mixed fleets, Western aircraft, legacy Soviet armor, indigenous upgrades, alliance standard command and control systems. Chinese platforms are typically designed to function optimally inside Chinese doctrine, Chinese data architectures, and Chinese command logic. According to RAND assessments published in 2022, many Chinese export systems rely on proprietary data links and closed digital architectures. From a U.S. defense planning perspective, this matters immediately, because coalition warfare is not about whether a radar sees a target. It is about whether that radar can share what it sees in real time with allied shooters, commanders, and decision-makers. The result is a familiar pattern. The system works, but it works alone. In joint exercises, this creates friction. In crises, it creates delay. And in wartime, delay is often indistinguishable from failure. Second, sustainment quietly determines combat value, not specifications. Chinese weapons are often marketed on performance metrics: range, speed, payload, protection. What is discussed far less is sustainment. Defense news reporting between 2022 and 2024 documented repeated concerns from operators of Chinese aircraft and armored vehicles regarding spare parts availability and maintenance timelines. From a U.S. and allied military perspective, this is not a minor issue. Readiness is not a theoretical concept, it is measured in availability rates. A platform that cannot be repaired locally, that requires factory-level support, or that depends on foreign technicians, introduces a vulnerability that grows over time. The second-order effect is subtle but dangerous. In peacetime, this creates frustration. In crisis, it creates hesitation. In wartime, it can ground fleets without a single enemy shot fired. Low upfront cost does not compensate for high operational fragility. Third, training and doctrine do not automatically travel with the hardware. Weapons are not just tools, they are embedded assumptions. Assumptions about command authority, about decision speed, about how information flows across units. RAND's 2021 research on arms transfer training highlights that Chinese export packages often prioritize technical operation over doctrinal integration. From Washington's perspective, this creates a gap. A system may be operable, but not fully absorbable. Crews learn how to use the platform. They do not always learn how to integrate it into combined arms operations, joint fires, or coalition command structures. The workaround becomes improvisation, and improvisation works until it doesn't. In high-tempo combat, forces fall back on what is institutionalized, not what is memorized. Fourth, no strings attached does not mean no leverage. Chinese arms sales are often framed as politically neutral. In a narrow sense, they are. There are usually no alliance obligations, no voting expectations, no public political conditions. But systems create their own gravity. According to SIPRI and RAND analyses from 2022, dependence emerges in predictable areas: software updates, ammunition compatibility, system upgrades, and technical support. From a U.S. and allied military planning perspective, leverage does not require coercion. It only requires option limitation. When a military cannot upgrade, sustain, or modify its systems without external approval or access, autonomy becomes conditional, even if no one ever says so out loud. This is not about pressure, it is about constraints, and constraints matter most during crises. Taken together, these four dynamics point to the same conclusion.
Chinese weapons do not usually fail catastrophically, they fail systemically. They create friction where modern warfare demands fluidity. They introduce dependence where autonomy was the goal, and they complicate coalition warfare at the exact moment when coalitions matter most. From a US and allied military perspective, this shifts the competitive question entirely. The competition is no longer about whose weapon has better specifications, it is about whose systems are easier to integrate, sustain, and trust, when the strategic environment stops being polite and starts being dangerous.
Here is the uncomfortable conclusion that tends to irritate everyone, including Western defense industries. Countries that buy Chinese weapons are not making irrational choices. They are often making the most rational choice available under their constraints. Budget ceilings are real, capability gaps are urgent, and political flexibility matters more to many governments than ideological alignment. From Washington's perspective, dismissing these decisions as short-sighted misses the strategic point. The real issue is not why Chinese weapons are chosen, it is why procurement is so often treated as the end of the decision, rather than the beginning of a 30-year relationship with a system. Western defense sales are slower, more bureaucratic, and often more politically complicated, but they come with something that rarely fits on a balance sheet: an ecosystem. Training pipelines that evolve over time, doctrine that adapts alongside the hardware, maintenance authority that gradually shifts to the operator, and interoperability that compounds rather than degrades. Chinese systems, by contrast, tend to optimize for the transaction. They deliver capability quickly, but they externalize integration costs, they delay sustainment problems, and they shift long-term risk onto the buyer. From a US and allied military perspective, this reframes the competition entirely. The strategic advantage is not about denying others access to Chinese weapons. That battle is already lost, and it should not be fought. The real competition is about which defense model is easier to live with for decades, not which platform looks better at delivery. And here is the critical insight. In modern warfare, militaries rarely fail because their equipment is inferior. They fail because their systems cannot absorb stress, adapt under pressure, or cooperate at scale. Weapons win battles. Systems decide wars. The question for Washington and its allies is whether they are communicating that reality clearly enough, not just to governments, but to the institutions that will still be operating those systems long after the signing ceremonies are forgotten.
This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite the scale of China's arms exports, they rarely translate into deep, durable military influence. According to CSIS analysis published in 2023, Chinese weapons sales show a weak correlation with long-term military integration, joint planning, or alliance-style alignment. From a US and allied perspective, that matters more than market share, because influence in modern warfare is not created by how many platforms you sell. It is created by how deeply your systems are embedded in how other militaries think, train, plan, and fight. And this is the paradox. Chinese weapons succeed commercially, but often fail systemically. They move quickly across borders, but they integrate slowly, if at all. They promise autonomy, but introduce quiet constraints. Meanwhile, Western systems do the opposite. They frustrate buyers up front. They impose paperwork, timelines, and conditions. They demand doctrinal alignment and institutional reform. But over time, they create something far more valuable than hardware. They create familiarity, trust, and operational reflexes that activate automatically in crisis. From Washington's perspective, this reveals a strategic asymmetry that is easy to overlook. China competes in the marketplace, the United States and its allies compete in ecosystems, and ecosystems are far harder to displace than individual platforms. The real contest, then, is not about who sells more weapons this year. It is about whose systems are still functioning, interoperating, and scaling under stress. When political neutrality collapses, supply chains fracture, and decisions must be made in minutes rather than months. In that environment, the most dangerous weakness is not inferior firepower, it is being alone inside your own force structure.
So when you hear the next headline about a country buying Chinese tanks, aircraft, or air defense systems, the most important question is not what they bought, it is what comes after the delivery. Who maintains it? Who upgrades it? Who trains the next generation of operators? And who it can actually fight alongside when the strategic environment turns hostile. From a US and allied defense planning perspective, this is the lesson that matters. Power today is not measured by procurement volume. It is measured by system resilience, by how well forces integrate under pressure, by how quickly coalitions can form, share data, and act without friction, and by how little improvisation is required when there is no time left to improvise. Chinese weapons will continue to sell. That is not a failure of Western strategy. But wars are not won by catalogs or contracts. They are won by systems that still work when politics breaks down, logistics fracture, and assumptions collapse. If you want to understand how future conflicts will actually be fought, not how they are advertised, follow the systems, not the sales figures. If this perspective helped reframe how you think about military power, stay with the channel. Because at Minh Quân Story, we do not read the news. We ask what it quietly changes for Washington, for its allies, and for the wars no one wants, but many are preparing for.